right.
There you go.
Thank you. Okay, good morning, guys. Happy Easter. Okay, all right. How you like my shirt? Okay, I always wanted to teach a class in blue jeans and a Hawaiian shirt, so here I am. This is cool, by the way. It's got all these battleships on from World War II. So at any rate, guys, we'll get started here. A couple of things that are causing some red flags on my end, okay? All right? 15 out of 24 of you accessed the last lecture. Now, I don't know how to do this. My daughter just happened to tell me that. I'm not going to check on you, okay? All right? But if it means you're not getting them, you need to call me. Now, you know, the other thing is you got to access them too, okay? All right? So at any rate, guys, okay, I'm proud of the 15 are doing this. That you couldn't work better than this. This is exactly the way it's supposed to work. Upcoming things now. You might have received an email from me about quiz number 7, okay? The last question, then question number 6, should have read Great Terror, not Red Terror, okay? So make that change because they are two different things. I explained it on an email, okay? All right. Those of you who don't get the emails, I sent out 3 memos to you guys, okay, about the fact that about that change. All right. Syllabus was updated, okay, with the changes for the course. You don't need to have it. You don't need to access it, but if you want to, it's all there. It's the stuff I sent you, okay, way back on March 21st. I handed out in class, okay, before we, it was sent you then in the mail. All right. The other things here, extra credit. Your extra credit now is going to boil down to basically answering another essay. In other words, on the sheet of paper that this is I know you can't see it, but it looks kind of like this, okay? All right, it's got all the brackets and all the essays, and it's got the readings that'll help you with that essay, plus the tutorials from the handout book that will help you with that essay, okay? You need to use that when you're answering your essays, okay? Read your segment in the book, listen to the recorded lectures, then go to the handout and compose your essays based upon my notes that are in that handout book, okay? That's how we do that. You have another essay coming up next week, okay? All right? So next week, I'll give you a shorter quiz, make it easier on you, maybe a 5-question one, okay? All right? But but you do have essay from bracket 3, okay? Remember, these can't be late because you have time to work on them at home, okay? All right? And that's that. So the bracket C, excuse me, okay, has 3 essays. One is discuss the validity of this statement. It's a miracle the Soviet Union survived the early 1920s. And I'm directing the handout book to pages 33, 37, 38, and even 39 and 40 will be helpful too. Basically, it's Lenin's Russia. How did he survive all this stuff? Okay, like the famine, the Red-White Civil War, all sorts of things like that. Question number 8 was basically describing the key events of Joseph Stalin. That's last week's lecture on how he rose to power. Be sure to examine all 3 phases of his reign. Now, his phases of his reign is going to include the Cold War, okay? And I'll be talking about that next week, okay? All right? So, if you don't have that Cold War phase in there, I'm not going to hammer you on it. But once I deliver the lecture and it's set out, and if you answer it after that, maybe an extra credit one or whatever, I will look for that information. All right, and it's got the pages to be read and everything else like this. Okay, this essay also reads, and does he deserve the title Russia's 20th Century Peter the Great? Do not go into a discussion of Peter the Great's reforms. Many times students do that with this essay. Don't. You're focused on Joseph Stalin, but think about that. Did he do for Russia, making it into a superpower, that Peter the Great did? And evaluate the two. Your call. You won't be wrong on what you say. Number 9, okay, which is the 3rd question in bracket C. Okay, assess the validity of this statement. The Second World War in Europe was run on the Russian front. Discuss key battles and turning points. Focus on the military aspects of this question. Now, here we go. Back on I think it was around the 27th of February, 26th was a Tuesday. I had you come into Gateway Lecture Hall because I was covering the Eastern Front in my World War II class. Most of you were there, so you've got this essay already. I don't have to go into the detail this morning on this recorded essay. And for those who were there, okay, all right, this will be helpful to give you a recap. And I also am going to approach things a little bit differently too, give you some data that you didn't get, okay, in that lecture hall back in February. So we're talking about World War II and Russia's impact on it and everything else like that. So that's our lecture today. And what else do I have here? Okay, go back at 3. Yeah, one other extra credit assignment that's no longer on the table, and nobody did this, but is what it is. All right, I had you assigned you to page 25 of the handout book and identifying different Russian authors and writers and poets. Okay, well that's off the table now. We're well past that. Okay, so the only extra credit assignments you have right now, if you want to do them, I know you're going to get questions about this, is you can pick another essay in the brackets. You can also watch a movie, okay, things like this, okay, all right? So in other words, when you send me stuff like that, make sure that you tell me it's extra credit, so I don't grade it as a paper or something like that. I'll repeat that. Anything extra credit has to be labeled as extra credit when I read it on an email. All right, you got your projects coming up too. Okay, the May 1st is the due date for that. So hopefully you've been working on that. The easiest things to do at this point are a book review, okay, all right, or a a set of movies, that sort of thing. Okay, all right. I gave you the option of Nicholas and Alexandra and Dr. Zhivago. It's a great one. Okay, all right. So guys, those are some of the projects you can work on. If you have questions, call me. Call me. I see kids on the phone all the time, yet I never get any phone calls. I feel like nobody likes me. Anyway, all right, so call me, we'll talk. We'll talk. It's better than the electronic crap, okay, that comes out. All right, let's get started now, okay? All right, I'm going to make this a relatively short one today because you got a lot of work coming up, okay? But I do want to recap what I spoke about before. In the years just leading up to World War II on the Eastern Front, that'll become the Eastern Front, keep in mind, Germany and Russia had formulated an alliance, okay, not a formal alliance, but a non-aggression pact. And this opened the door for Russia to do her thing. She went to war with Finland in the Russo-Finnish War of 1939-40. She annexed the Baltic states. Germany, on the other hand, turned westward, okay, to attack the Low Countries, attacked Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Norway, etc., okay. Before that, they met in the middle, okay, which is Poland. As Germany invaded Poland from the west, Russia invaded Poland from the east about 2.5 weeks later, all right? It looked to the world like these two guys are allied. So why in the world did, on June 22nd, 1941, did Hitler go after Russia? Well, a couple of things. So, one of the worst things you can do in coaching, and I've been down this road myself, okay, as well as military arts, things like this, is underestimate your enemy. Never underestimate them, okay, all right? It's a recipe for disaster. Hitler saw that Stalin had purged his officer corps. 70% of them were arrested and shot or went to the camps, okay, all right? He also saw how the tough fight that the Russians had in the war against Finland, okay? They should have swept through that country like a knife through butter. They didn't. And it took them some 2 months to get it done, okay, all right? So maybe 3. Anyway, the idea is that he underestimates Russia. When he invaded Russia on June 22nd, 1941, in the biggest land invasion in history, 2 million men, 200 divisions, 3,600 tanks, okay, all right, come rumbling across the border. A, it takes Stalin by surprise. How that happened, we'll never know, okay? B, all right, he thinks it's going to be over by the end of October. He never even bothered to issue winter uniforms to his troops. So they come rumbling across the border despite repeated warnings from Russian intelligence. Okay, well, by the way, another thought too. There's an earlier lecture that was taped. I just came across in my notebook here. An earlier lecture that was taped back when this whole plague started and we started to shut down the schools and things like that. And it was in early March on the wartime conferences. That was sent to you as well by Rob Rudnicki. He did the taping. Okay, so please listen to that one too. That's part of the World War II setting. And I will have a question or two in your next quiz about that. All right. Now, the Russians call this the Great Patriotic War. Russia begins to fall back. They're losing huge losses in the big encircling movements by the German army, things like this. The German army is indeed moving like a knife through butter. Okay, all right. The Red Army is not standing up to this. In the end, the Russians are going to win. Stalin's going to win this thing. okay, all right? But it's going to consume 1,118 days, and this is an average of over 18,000 killed per day. Guys, think about this, okay, all right? Germany is going to lose 80% of its army on the Eastern Front. They'll be swallowed up by the Red Army, okay, all right? So you could argue that what happens at Normandy and things like this in the Western Front, as heroic as it is, as important in American history as it is in the eyes of the Russians of little consequence. They felt they won the war, and they're not wrong in saying that, okay? I would say this to you, that the invasions of Normandy later on, as the Allies are sweeping the British and Americans and French and Canadians, etc., are swinging across Western Europe, all right, that's going to basically create a setting for the Cold War, preventing Russia from overrunning Germany and overrunning the west of Europe. They're there, and they're going to stop any flood tide of the Red Army coming across Europe out of Germany. So, at any rate, guys, let's talk now about this invasion in and of itself. 3 attack points, 3 prongs, 3 lines of advance, as they talk about it in military terms. One sweeps up, we'll try to gesture the way you would see it, okay, on a map. One sweeps up along the Baltic Sea, okay, all right, and they're going to go after Leningrad. Leningrad is going to undergo a siege of 900 days, okay, and it's a nightmare scenario. Let me show you now with a series of readings that I did not do when I did that lecture back in February, what I'm talking about here. All right. Leningrad's terrible winter. The coldest in modern times, with an average temperature in December of 9 degrees above zero and 4 degrees below zero in January. The ground froze like iron. The weakened Leningraders had no strength to hack out graves. Now remember, the heating systems, the electrical systems are all shut down because of the bombing and the artillery bombardment. The weakened Leningraders had no strength to hack out graves, and most corpses lay on the surface, gradually becoming buried under snow and ice. Some were placed in common graves, actually long trenches dynamited by army sappers. They were sometimes buried in open squares, okay? And at the more than 662, I'll repeat that, more than 662 common graves, all right, were dug in the winter of 1941-42 for a total length of 20,000 yards. One guy who was involved in the factory owners there, a guy named Y.I. Krasnovatsky, you don't have to remember his name. I remember the picture exactly. It was freezing cold, the bodies were frozen. They were hoisted into trucks. They even had a metallic ring. When I first went into the cemetery, every hair stood on my head to see a mountain of corpses and the people themselves hardly alive, throwing the bodies into the trenches with expressionless faces. That Leningrad siege will not be lifted until basically about January of 1945, okay, all right? The second prong goes right to Moscow. This is Army Group Center. Well, the best Russian general is going to be involved in the defense of Moscow, Georgy Zhukov. The Germans, will get within 20 miles of Moscow. Some say 12, okay, all right? So reportedly, they could see the spires of the different cathedrals and the different churches in the distance. Well, Georgy Zhukov counterattacks on December 5th and begins a relentless drive that's going to push that Army Group Center all the way back to Berlin. All right, the collapse of Army Group Center is going to play a role. Now, I'm making it easier to understand here. There's a lot that happens in the way, okay? But basically, that objective of taking Moscow was never seen, never reached. And give Stalin some credit. All right, he stayed there during the whole time. Okay, had a train running 24/7 in a train depot that he could bail out if he had to. But don't criticize him for that. Army Group South heads toward Kiev in the Ukraine. Kiev will fall in September of 1942, okay, and the tanks are rumbling across what's perfect tank country, the farms and fields of the flat, open Ukrainian terrain. All right, they're approaching the Don River. They'll seize Kharkov. There'll be a disastrous Russian counterattack to try to take Kharkov back. All right, but at any rate, that failed. The Germans continue. Winter will set in with them just across the Don River. Now, you remember from your maps, okay, where the Don is. It comes out of the Sea of Azov and swings kind of north and then swings westward. Anyway, across the Don, you're approaching the Volga River. Or if you swing south toward the Caucasus, you're going to get to the oil fields of Russia. Now, stop for a second. what did Hitler really want to accomplish? He wanted to take the Ukraine and those oil fields. Why didn't he direct all of his resources, that 2 million plus man army, okay, all right, and hold that territory? He's taken that, at least part of it. He did reach the Caucasus oil fields, all right. Why did he go after these other objectives? I can understand it from a political sense, but in a military logic, he had accomplished what he wanted to, but he goes for more. Then he goes after the city of Stalingrad, and it's more than just the fact that it's named Stalingrad. I went into that in my lecture the other day, back in February, about how it was a main city on the Volga River, which was the primary supply route for the Allies sending material and things into Russia. And I gave you numbers about this. The United States would try to get supplies into Russia through the Murmansk Run, okay, which is up in the North Atlantic, the North Sea, the Straits of Denmark, and into the Arctic Circle, city of Murmansk. But that becomes a deadly ground for German U-boats. The other access point was up through the Caspian Sea, where the Volga enters into it. All right, and you can swing up the Volga and feed those Russian armies from the back. Okay, all right. At any rate, guys, okay, that becomes crucial in that regard. If Stalingrad falls, and it almost did, if Stalingrad falls, okay, you're going to have now the cutting of that supply line. The supplies. Stalin had done something good. He had shifted the military, the factories, okay, east of the Ural Mountains. Okay, remember for your maps the Ural Mountains. All right, and listen to this quote now. Behind the Urals, the Russians produced 4,500 tanks, 3,000 aircraft, 14,000 guns, and 50,000 mortars during the winter months of 1942-43. If he never shifted those factories eastward, he would have lost them to Army Group South in the Ukraine, because that's where a lot of the industrial factories, industrial plants were. That was a good move on his part. Okay, so the Russians are able to rebound with Allied help, and also too with what they're producing themselves, and also too the gritty determination of the soldiers in the Red Army. Stalin issues order like no step backwards. Okay, you cannot retreat. Officers who did that would be taken out and shot. He shot 3 generals before Stalingrad. Now back to Stalingrad. This is one of the great turning points in World War II. It's a battle that begins in late August of 1942 and doesn't end until early February of 1943. It is house to house, block to block, room to room, all right? And a story I didn't tell in that lecture, there's one famous episode of something called the Pavlov House, okay, all right? It's basically a department store. Picture a Boscov's or a Macy's, okay, all right? 60 men held that building for 58 days. Russian troops held that building for 58 days standing off the Germans. This is how brutal this battle was, all right? The idea here is that you're going to see 1.1 million Russians killed, captured, or wounded, and between 250 and 300,000 Germans by the end of the day, closer to 250,000. Okay, all right. One of the biggest, if not the biggest land battle in all of human history. Now, some historians are pointing to another turning point as being that defense of Moscow. Okay, I don't disagree with that. All right, but everybody keeps coming back to Stalingrad and how important that is. Okay, I'll never forget watching my beloved Buffalo Bills on TV, okay? And they're playing a game in a snowstorm. And Chris Berman, who used to like as a broadcaster on ESPN, said it. He referred to Stalingrad. He was a Bills fan, by the way. He said it, okay, when he went to the highlights, okay? He said, in conditions better suited for the defense of Stalingrad, the Buffalo Bills have taken on the Houston Oilers, okay? All right? So Stalingrad rings in history as one of the titanic battles. Well, the Eastern Front is going to stabilize by about the spring of 1943. After Stalingrad, they've driven back the Germans at the face of Moscow. All right, and Leningrad's still under siege, but at least it's stabilized. The turning point then is the war's going to start to turn then when the Russians begin a counteroffensive. They had begun a series of offensives driving back to Army Group Center from Moscow. Okay, and also to the offensive called Operation Uranus. There's a joke there, but I'm not going to go there. All right. Anyway, in which they pinched off the German Sixth Army. Okay, I should address it this way: pinched off the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad and forcing the surrender of Stalingrad. All right, so they were capable of counteroffensive that at times worked. They were also capable of ones that were disasters, such as the one at Kharkov in 42. Anyway, okay, all right. The big counteroffensive begins in July at a place called Kursk. I talked about this in the class on in Gateway. All right, Kursk was a salient. In other words, it's a bulge in the line. If the line is here and there's a bulge right here where my fist is, okay, the Germans have surrounded it and they want to pinch it off. Okay, all right. Why? Because the Allies have landed in Sicily and Italy, and Hitler needs more men to be shifted over there. Think about it. If the line here has troops around it, you reduce that salient. Now you have those troops in one straight line. It can be fewer troops. Fewer guys in a straight line. Okay, so the counteroffensive opens. It'll become the biggest tank battle in history. Some 7,000 tanks are destroyed, and as many as 13,000 are involved here. Now you're going to get varying numbers, but those are the numbers I read most often. Okay, and the Russians win. They hold back the German onslaught at Kursk. This is the last German offensive of the war on the Eastern Front. By now, after that, so after all, beginning in August and September, all right, the Russians then begin a counterattack all along the Eastern Front, from Moscow down to the oil fields of the Caucasus. Hitler never took those oil fields. That's another big mistake he made in World War. Now think about this, okay, all right, and it's out of our discussion here because of the Russian history class, but he failed to take the oil fields in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia. He was headed that way. He failed to take them in the Caucasus. Do you need oil for modern warfare? World War II is an oil war. People don't look at it that way, but it is. Okay, so at any rate, he failed to take them. Okay, and I spoke about the winter conditions and things like this. I gave you a brief reading the other day in that class back in Gateway, and it just talks about, listen to this, okay? It was the winter of 1942-43 was the worst winter in 15 years, okay? The average temperature around Moscow was 20 degrees below zero, okay, all right? And at that point, lubricating oil on tanks and machine guns begins to freeze, okay? Even firing begins to become brittle. Tanks can't run, their turrets can't turn. The Germans aren't ready for this, and Hitler, expecting the war to be over by now, never even issued winter uniforms. His men are freezing and dying. This is why we say the war was won. World War II in Europe was won on the Eastern Front. The counterattack is not a knife through butter. It's a begrudging fallback by the German army, all right? And the Russians are going to basically clear the Germans out of the territory in Russia by about the fall, August and February of 1944. By then they've cleared them out, and they're approaching Poland. One of the more horrible stories occurs in Poland. When the Germans are holding the city of Warsaw along the Vistula River, and the Russians are approaching. And the Russians send radio signals to the Polish resistance, their home army, to rise up within Warsaw. We will punch across the Vistula and rescue you. It'll make the liberation of Poland quicker and easier. Well, the Polish home army did rise up. The Russians didn't move. All right, and in the Warsaw Rising, okay, all right, the numbers here are literally appalling. Let me just get to it in my notes here. Okay, all right. It lasted 63 days. 750,000 were killed, including civilians. All right, about 40,000 was the official number. And finally, on January 17th, okay, Warsaw was captured. The city was utterly destroyed by the German army. They will now slide into Berlin. They'll go through East Prussia to the north. Okay, all right, they're approaching. Remember, the Allies on the Western Front, America, Britain, etc., by the fall of 1944, they're in the Low Countries. They're in Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg. They've liberated France. So they're closing in on Germany from the west. Russia's closing in on the east. All right? Atrocities begin to be heard of, okay, in Budapest and in the Baltic states. This is not a very pleasant reading. okay? But let me just describe for you what I'm talking about here. Oh, sorry, guys, hang on a second, okay? The first rumors of large-scale atrocities came out of Hungary. The fighting for Budapest had been long and hard. 80,000 Soviet troops were killed. On the Buda side of the river, the city's divided by the Danube River, Buda and Pest. On the Buda side of the river, the Russian troops ransacked the city for food and alcohol before turning on the female population, some of whom were locked up in soldiers' barracks and repeatedly raped. This is going to occur again in East Prussia. This is going to occur again in Berlin. They estimate the rape total will be 100,000 in Berlin alone. That leads me now to the final stage, which is the liberation of Berlin. By March of 1945, okay, the Allies across the Rhine at the bridge at Remagen were entering German territory. Actually, had entered it earlier on as German territory west of the Rhine. Right? But at any rate, we're crossing that mythical border, the Rhine River, and the Russians are closing in from the east. They're going to be launching, okay, an attack with as many as 3 million men closing in on Germany. Politically, Churchill wants Berlin, Stalin wants Berlin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt wants Berlin. Remember the big three. Go back to that lecture I gave you on the wartime conferences. Right? And what you're going to have now is this, a debate about who's going to take it. The best answer is found in something written by Stephen Ambrose. To put it another way, he refused to race the Russians to Berlin. Who's he? He is Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander in Western Europe. Eisenhower was much criticized for this. It remains his most controversial decision of the war. It's been much written about, including by me, meaning the author here, Stephen Ambrose. I have nothing to add to the debate except this. In 30 years of interviewing GIs, of reading their books and unpublished memoirs, of corresponding with them, I have not yet heard one of them say that he wanted to go charging into Berlin. For the GIs, what stood out about Eisenhower's decision was that he put them first. If the Russians wanted to get in the ultimate street fight, that would be their business. The street fighting in Berlin, in the rubble of Berlin, will last for about 3 weeks, okay? And in the course and the process of it, between 80,000 and 100,000 Russian soldiers will die. 80 to 100,000 Russian soldiers, not Americans. That's what Eisenhower was thinking, all right? So the Russians have then liberated Berlin, and you're going to get, in the early week of May, okay, VE Day. VE Day is May 8th, and for us, it's May 9th for the Russians. That's when they accepted the Russian surrender. A couple of other things to be talked about here. If one of the movies you're going to do for extra credit is Defiance, good movie, talks about the Jews rising in resistance in Belarus. Okay, about 250,000 resistance fighters, okay, pinned down about 250,000 German troops, okay. The Russian resistance was brutal, even on a local scale. One of the books you could read is a book called Last Citadel by Robbins. It's a historical novel about the Battle of Kursk, and it talks about the night witches, the Russian women who served as snipers, okay, in fact, the most famous sniper of the war, Ludmila Pavlichenko, had 309 recorded kills. She was a dead shot. Annie Oakley here. Came to the United States later on. And also to the night witches were the aircraft, the women flying the planes. I spoke about this in that lecture back in Gateway, and they were given the old equipment, but they basically would cut their engines coming in at night, okay, to bombard German positions, and they would swoop down and release their bombs silently. Boom, everything goes up. They start the engine up, gun it, and get out of there. Okay, that's the only way they could do this with rickety old biplane bombers. All right. The men got the better planes, the Yak fighters and things like that. All right. Russia will also join the war in the Pacific. In the end, as per a promise made by Stalin at Yalta, they're going to invade Manchuria. Just before, the best way to put this in perspective is they invade between the two droppings of the atomic bombs. So August 6th and August 9th, they're going to invade the morning of August 9th. Just after midnight, come pouring across the border into Manchuria to take on the Japanese troops. Okay, all right? To show you this, the magnitude, 20 to 30 trains crossed eastward okay, into Siberia, loaded with troops, 1.7 million, okay, each day. Not 1.7 million each day, but 20 to 30 trains, a total of 1.7 million. They open up the attack on August 9th. They're going to lose 12,000, and they're going to penetrate into Korea till they're finally stopped with Japan's surrender. And where are they? At the 38th parallel, separating communist North Korea from free South Korea. It's kind of interesting when you put it all together here. So World War II has been called, you know, one of the great pivotal events of world history, and it certainly warrants that. And you can see here the role played by the Russians here. How much damage did they suffer? Just a brief one here, okay, all right. Material losses were similarly enormous, and the destruction suffered in the fighting. Huge areas of the country were devastated, frequently more than once, at the hands of the retreating army or the withdrawing Germans. The Red Army followed a scorched earth policy, and you should know what that is, okay, burning everything in the path so the enemy can't use it. Okay, all right. Much of the Soviet Union became an utter wasteland. Soviet material losses in the war included the partial or total destruction of 1,700 towns, 70,000 villages, 6 million buildings, 84,000 schools, 43,000 libraries, 31,000 factories, 1,300 bridges. Also demolished were 98,000 kolkhozes and 2,000 sovkhozes. What were the kolkhozes? They were those big collective farms that Stalin had created in the 1930s. Okay, all right? They're destroyed. And he gets into other figures too as well. But what's more important is this single figure. How many Russians died? 27 million. This is more than, by far, than we've ever had in all of our wars combined. More than any other nation in Europe. It's half the total destruction of all of the nations in terms of human losses in the war. Listen to this quote now. We'll end up with this. For every Briton or American who died in World War II, the Japanese lost 7 people, the Germans lost 20. The Soviets lost 85. For every American soldier, they lost 85 that died in the war. 4/5 of the fighting on the Second World War, 4/5, 80%, took place on the Eastern Front. 2/3 of the German army were in the East even after D-Day. 98% of all German soldiers, 93%, another say 80% of all German soldiers. I think 80% is probably more accurate, okay? But I'll give you one more to end on. I promise, last one, all right? Your age in the Red Army. How difficult was it for them to survive the war? Of every 19-year-old that was drafted in the Red Army, only 3% return home after the war. They lose a generation of manhood. World War II is a horror story, particularly in the Eastern Front. So, I've given you a lot of things to think about today. I'll keep your quiz short for next week, okay? But get on working on essay number 3, okay? Because that'll be due on Thursday. All right, guys? Okay? I'll see you next week. Thanks.